The detention center's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls where Marcus Chon sat in his cell. Outside, protesters chanted slogans about justice and revenge, their voices echoing through the barred windows. It was Tuesday morning, and in 6 hours he would face the firing squad for crimes he had never committed, framed by a corrupt system that needed a scapegoat for the embassy bombing. Marcus had been a humanitarian aid worker in the HFY, war-torn region of Karabestan when the explosion killed 37 people. Security footage, later proven to be doctored, showed someone matching his description near the building. The real perpetrators had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only a convenient foreigner to blame. "Time to go," announced Warden Kozlov, his keys jangling against the metal bars. Behind him stood 3 guards, their faces masks of professional indifference. They had executed dozens of prisoners, and Marcus would be just another name in their logbooks. The walk to the courtyard felt surreal. Each step echoed off the narrow corridor walls, past cells where other condemned men watched silently. Some spat curses at the guards, others wept for their families. Marcus simply walked, his mind strangely calm despite the approaching finality. In the execution yard, a crowd of officials had gathered. The prosecutor, Ahmad Nazari, stood with his arms crossed, satisfied that justice would finally be served. The ambassador from Marcus's home country watched with grim resignation. His protests had fallen on deaf ears. Members of the victims, families clustered together, their faces etched with grief and rage. Marcus was led to the center of the yard, where a simple wooden chair awaited. The executioners, 5 soldiers in black uniforms, checked their rifles with practiced efficiency. Their commander, Colonel Vahid, had overseen hundreds of executions and prided himself on maintaining order during these proceedings. "Any last words?" Colonel Vahid asked, though his tone suggested he hoped for none. Marcus looked around at the assembled crowd, the officials seeking political advantage, the guards following orders, the grieving families hungry for closure. Even the executioners, who had convinced themselves that pulling triggers was somehow different from murder. He saw fear in all their eyes, though they masked it with authority and righteousness. "I forgive you," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "All of you. The ones who framed me, the ones who condemned me, and the ones about to kill me. I understand you believe this is justice." The words struck the crowd like physical blows. Colonel Vahid's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he raised it to give the signal. He had expected pleading, anger, maybe defiance, anything. But this calm acceptance that somehow made him feel like the guilty party. Prosecutor Nazari shifted uncomfortably. He had built his career on righteous indignation, but something in the condemned man's tone made his certainty waver. The ambassador looked away, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. Even the victims' families, who had come seeking the satisfaction of revenge, found themselves questioning what they were about to witness. The executioners raised their rifles, but their usual mechanical precision felt different this time. They weren't facing a criminal begging for mercy or cursing their names. They were aiming at someone who had already forgiven them for what they were about to do, and that forgiveness felt heavier than any hatred could have been. In that moment of suspended time, everyone in the courtyard realized they were confronting something that challenged everything they believed about justice, punishment, and the nature of good and evil. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the embassy, just as news of the execution reached the international community. As a forensic psychologist specializing in wrongful convictions, she had spent years studying cases like Marcus Chon's. But this one was different, not because of the evidence, which she had already proven was fabricated, but because of what had happened in that courtyard. The execution had proceeded as scheduled, but its aftermath was unprecedented. Colonel Vahid had submitted his resignation within hours, unable to explain to his superiors why he could no longer perform his duties. 3 of the 5 executioners had requested transfers to non-combat positions. The prison guards reported nightmares and an inability to look at themselves in mirrors. "It's like a psychological contagion," Dr. Mitchell explained to Ambassador Williams as they reviewed the incident reports. "But instead of spreading fear or hatred, it's spreading something else entirely, a kind of moral awakening that's proving more terrifying to these men than any enemy they've ever faced." City's main hospital, Dr. Rashid Farouk, treated the strangest cases of his career. Prosecutor Nazari had been admitted with what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown, repeatedly mumbling about the weight of forgiveness. 2 of the executioners had arrived with severe insomnia and panic attacks. Even some of the victims' families were seeking counseling, disturbed by feelings they couldn't understand. Ambassador Williams paced his office, frustrated by the diplomatic implications. "We have a martyr on our hands, and martyrs are dangerous. The local government is already worried about public opinion shifting." But Dr. Mitchell saw something else in the reports. Security footage from the prison showed something extraordinary in the days following the execution. Violence among inmates had dropped dramatically. Guards reported that even the most hardened criminals had become unusually quiet and reflective. It was as if Marcus's final act had created ripples that were spreading far beyond the prison walls. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Elena Vasquez was piecing together the real story behind the embassy bombing. Her sources had finally revealed the truth: a complex conspiracy involving arms dealers, corrupt officials, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of government. Marcus Chun had been innocent, exactly as he had claimed. "We have to go public with this," Elena told her editor, Carlos Mendez, as they reviewed the evidence. "The man was executed for crimes he didn't commit, and his innocence makes his final words even more powerful." Carlos hesitated. "The government won't like this. They'll claim we're destabilizing the region, stirring up trouble." "The trouble is already stirring itself," Elena replied, showing him reports of spontaneous gatherings throughout the city. People were leaving flowers at the prison gates, not in the usual display of angry protest, but in quiet vigils that seemed to ask deeper questions about justice and mercy. In the presidential palace, Defense Minister Halil Mazari reviewed intelligence reports with growing concern. "The situation is becoming problematic," he told President Rashad. "This Chun's execution was supposed to provide closure, but it's having the opposite effect. People are asking uncomfortable questions." President Rashad studied the reports of the spreading psychological phenomenon. Military units were reporting decreased morale and increased requests for discharge. Police officers were refusing overtime assignments. Even government officials were becoming strangely reluctant to participate in the usual harsh measures. What exactly did this man do to cause this? The president asked. Minister Mazari's expression was troubled. According to all witnesses, he simply forgave everyone completely and unconditionally. No anger, no hatred, no desire for revenge. Just forgiveness for people who were about to kill him for crimes he didn't commit. The president felt an uncomfortable chill. In his long career of political survival, he had learned to fear many things: revolt, conspiracy, economic collapse. But he had never imagined being afraid of forgiveness. Yet here was evidence that unconditional mercy could be more destabilizing than any weapon. Outside the palace walls, the city was changing in ways that defied explanation, and everyone involved was beginning to understand that they had witnessed something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and the true nature of strength. 3 weeks after the execution, FBI Special Agent David Park arrived in Karabestan with a small team of investigators. The American government had finally agreed to conduct an independent investigation into Marcus Chun's case. Though Park suspected It was more about managing the growing international pressure than seeking truth. His first stop was the prison, where Warden Kozlov met him with obvious reluctance. The facility had been transformed since the execution, not physically, but atmospherically. The usual tension and barely controlled violence had been replaced by an eerie calm that made even hardened correction officers uncomfortable. The inmates have been different, Kozlov admitted as they walked through the cell blocks. We've had no fights, no disciplinary incidents. They just sit in their cells, staring at nothing, like they're thinking about things they'd rather not think about. In cell block D, Park interviewed Viktor Petrov, a notorious gang leader serving multiple life sentences. The massive man, covered in prison tattoos and scars from countless fights, sat hunched on his narrow bunk, looking somehow smaller than his reputation suggested. "You saw the execution?" Park asked. Victor's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. "I seen lots of men die. Some begging, some cursing, some trying to be brave. Never seen nothing like what that American did." "What exactly did he do?" "He looked at us all, the guards, the warden, even us watching from the windows, and he forgave us. Not just the ones killing him, but all of us. Like he could see every bad thing we ever done, and chose to forgive it anyway." Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been having dreams where I gotta face all the people I hurt, and they all looking at me the way he looked at his killers." Meanwhile, Dr. Mitchell had established a temporary clinic in the city to study the psychological phenomenon. Her most disturbing case was Colonel Vahid, who had agreed to be interviewed after his resignation was rejected by military command. "I've executed 17 men in my career," Vahid told her, his uniform pristine but his eyes haunted. "Terrorists, murderers, traitors. Each time, I told myself I was serving justice, protecting society. But when that American looked at me, really looked at me, I saw myself through his eyes." "What did you see?" Vahid's composure cracked. "A man who had convinced himself that following orders made murder acceptable. A man who had spent years practicing the mechanics of killing without ever questioning whether it was right. He stared at his hands. He forgave me before I even pulled the trigger. How do you live with that kind of mercy?" Across the city, Elena Vasquez's investigation had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. The real bombers were members of an international arms trafficking ring, working with corrupt government officials to destabilize peace negotiations. Marcus Chun had been selected as a scapegoat specifically because he was foreign and had no powerful connections to protect him. "We have names, dates, financial records," Elena told Dr. Mitchell during their meeting at a small cafe. Marcus Chun was completely innocent, and the people who framed him knew it from the beginning. Dr. Mitchell stirred her coffee thoughtfully, which makes his forgiveness even more extraordinary. It's one thing to forgive people who made an honest mistake. It's another entirely to forgive those who deliberately destroyed your life. The revelation of Marcus's innocence was spreading through unofficial channels, despite government attempts at suppression. Social media posts, whispered conversations, and underground newspapers were carrying the story to every corner of the country. The reaction was unlike anything anyone had predicted. In the wealthy districts, business executives were quietly restructuring their companies to provide better wages and working conditions. In the poor neighborhoods, gang leaders were calling for truces and peace talks. Even in government offices, bureaucrats were finding excuses to avoid participating in the usual corruption and brutality. President Rishad called an emergency cabinet meeting as reports of the spreading mercy epidemic reached his desk. "This is becoming a national security issue," he declared. "People are questioning everything: the justice system, the military, even their own behavior. We're losing control of the narrative." Defense Minister Mazzari looked grim. "Military discipline is eroding." Soldiers are requesting reassignment to humanitarian duties. Police are reporting for duty, but refusing to use force. It's as if the entire country is having a crisis of conscience. All because of one executed man? President Rashad asked incredulously. One executed innocent man who responded to injustice with forgiveness, Dr. Mitchell had written in her preliminary report, which had been leaked to the press. Marcus Chon demonstrated that true strength isn't the power to destroy your enemies, but the choice to love them despite their hatred. And that kind of strength is proving more terrifying to those in power than any army. As the investigation continued, everyone involved was beginning to realize that they weren't just uncovering a wrongful execution. They were witnessing the birth of something that could transform an entire society. If it didn't tear it apart first. 2 months after Marcus Chon's execution, the country of Caribestan was experiencing what sociologists would later term collective moral awakening, and its government was on the verge of collapse. Agent Parks' investigation had reached its conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus had been framed by a conspiracy involving Defense Minister Mazari, arms dealer Sergei Volkov, and a network of corrupt officials who had profited from regional instability. The real bombers had been eliminated to prevent them from talking, and Marcus had been selected as a convenient scapegoat. But the legal case was the least of anyone's concerns now. The psychological phenomenon that had begun in the execution courtyard was spreading beyond the borders of Caribestan. News reports from neighboring countries described similar outbreaks of unexpected mercy and forgiveness among people who had heard Marcus's story. Dr. Mitchell's research team had documented over 3,000 cases of what they termed empathetic moral crisis, individuals who had experienced profound psychological transformation after learning about Marcus's final act. The symptoms were consistent: intense guilt over past actions, inability to participate in violence or cruelty, obsessive need to make amends for previous wrongdoings. It's like a virus, explained Dr. Ahmed Hassan, the hospital's chief psychiatrist. But instead of causing illness, it's causing people to develop acute moral sensitivity. They can no longer ignore the suffering they've caused or participated in. The government's response had been predictably harsh. President Rashad declared martial law, hoping to suppress the growing movement of people who called themselves Marcus's children, individuals who had committed to living by his example of unconditional forgiveness. But the military's response was complicated by the fact that many soldiers were themselves affected by the phenomenon. General Yusuf Mahmoud, the Army's chief of staff, found himself facing an unprecedented crisis when an entire battalion refused orders to disperse a peaceful vigil at the prison. "They're not rebelling," he reported to the president. "They're just unable to participate in violence. They stand at attention. They follow non-violent orders. But when it comes to using force against civilians, they freeze up." Elena Vasquez's expose had finally been published internationally, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy and Marcus's innocence. The story had gone viral, with millions of people around the world learning about the humanitarian worker who had forgiven his killers even as they executed him for crimes he didn't commit. The international response was swift and severe. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and demands for justice put enormous pressure on President Rashad's government. But the real threat came from within, as the country's own people began to question everything they had been taught about power, justice, and survival. In the presidential palace, President Rashad faced his cabinet with growing desperation. "We need to regain control of the narrative," he insisted. "This Chun was just a dead man. How can a corpse threaten national security?" But Defense Minister Mazari, one of the architects of the conspiracy, was experiencing his own crisis of conscience. The weight of his guilt had become unbearable since Elena's investigation had proven Marcus's innocence. "Perhaps," he said quietly, The question isn't how to stop this phenomenon, but whether we should. The room fell silent. President Rashad stared at his most trusted ally in disbelief. "Are you suggesting we simply surrender to mass hysteria?" "I'm suggesting," Mazzari replied, "that maybe this hysteria is actually sanity. Maybe we've been the ones living in madness, convincing ourselves that power justifies any cruelty. That survival requires the destruction of our enemies." He stood slowly. "Marcus Chun showed us what real strength looks like, and now we can't unsee it." Outside the palace, the city had transformed into something unprecedented. Strangers were helping each other without expectation of reward. Former enemies were seeking reconciliation. Police officers were resigning rather than enforce unjust laws. Even hardened criminals were turning themselves in and seeking to make amends for their crimes. The change was spreading to other sectors of society. As well, corporate executives were voluntarily reducing their salaries to pay workers better wages. Landlords were forgiving debts and offering free housing to those in need. Religious leaders from different faiths were working together to establish community centers and food banks. But the most powerful transformation was occurring in the families of those who had participated in Marcus's execution. Colonel Vahid's wife, Amira, had organized a group of military families to petition for an end to capital punishment. The executioner's children were leading peace education programs in schools. Even the prosecutor's family was working to establish legal aid clinics for the poor. Dr. Mitchell published her final report on what she called the Marcus effect, a phenomenon where exposure to extreme moral courage and forgiveness creates a psychological crisis that forces individuals to confront their own capacity for both good and evil. The report concluded that such crises, while initially traumatic, could lead to profound personal and societal transformation. As the country stood at the crossroads between its violent past and an uncertain but potentially redemptive future, everyone involved realized that Marcus Chun's death had accomplished something that no army, no government, and no revolution had ever achieved. It had forced an entire nation to look in the mirror and question whether they liked what they saw. 6 months after Marcus Chun's execution, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the same courtyard where he had died, but the space had been transformed. The walls that once echoed with the sound of gunfire now surrounded a memorial garden where families came to reflect on the meaning of justice, mercy, and redemption. The government of President Rashad had fallen, not through revolution or military coup, but through a simple loss of legitimacy. When the majority of civil servants, military personnel, and police officers refused to participate in violence or corruption, the state apparatus had essentially dissolved. In its place, a transitional council had emerged, led by former Colonel Vahid and including Dr. Hassan, Elena Vasquez, and other figures who had been transformed by the Marcus effect. "We're not trying to build a utopia," Vahid explained to the international observers who had come to document the unprecedented transition. "We're trying to build a society where people like Marcus Chun aren't executed for crimes they didn't commit, where mercy isn't seen as weakness, and where strength is measured by our ability to protect rather than destroy." The changes were remarkable, but not without challenges. The economy had initially suffered as corrupt practices were abandoned and exploitative businesses reformed. Crime rates had plummeted, but so had productivity as people struggled to adapt to new ways of living and working that prioritized human dignity over profit. Agent Park had completed his investigation and returned to the United States, but not unchanged. His final report to the FBI had been as much philosophical as factual, describing how witnessing the Marcus effect had forced him to examine his own assumptions about justice and law enforcement. Marcus Chun was executed for a crime he didn't commit, Park had written, but his death exposed crimes that all of us commit daily: the crime of indifference to suffering, the crime of choosing convenience over conscience, the crime of believing. that some people are worth less than others. Elena Vasquez had won international recognition for her investigative work, but she had chosen to remain in Carabeston to document the ongoing transformation. Her daily reports had become essential reading for psychologists, sociologists, and political scientists trying to understand how a single act of forgiveness could reshape an entire society. The Marcus effect isn't just about one man's extraordinary response to injustice, she wrote in her latest piece. It's about the recognition that we all have the capacity for both cruelty and compassion, and that the choice between them determines not just our individual character, but the character of our civilization. Dr. Mitchell's research had expanded to include similar phenomena in other parts of the world. Communities that had heard Marcus's story were reporting their own transformations reduced violence, increased cooperation, and what she termed moral contagion spreading through social networks. The Memorial Garden had become an unlikely pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from around the world who came to understand how a humanitarian worker's final act of forgiveness had created ripples that were still spreading. The inscription on the memorial stone was simple: Marcus Chun, 1985 to 2024. He chose mercy over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, love over fear. In doing so, he showed us who we could become. But perhaps the most profound transformation was occurring in the prison system itself. Former inmates, inspired by Marcus's example, had established rehabilitation programs that focused on reconciliation rather than punishment. Victims' families worked alongside former criminals to heal communities torn apart by violence and crime. Warden Kozlov, who had initially resisted the changes, found himself leading the reform effort. I spent 20 years believing that punishment was justice, he reflected. Marcus showed us that justice isn't about making people suffer for their crimes. It's about helping them become people who are incapable of committing those crimes again. The international community was still struggling to understand and respond to the Carabeston transformation. Some countries had imposed sanctions, fearing the spread of what they termed radical pacifism. Others had sent delegations to study the new social model. Most were simply watching and waiting to see if a society built on forgiveness rather than force could actually survive. As Dr. Mitchell prepared to leave the memorial garden, she encountered a young girl placing flowers at the stone. The child looked up with curious eyes and asked, "Did you know the man who's buried here?" "No," Dr. Mitchell replied, "but he changed my life anyway." How can someone you never met change your life? Dr. Mitchell knelt beside the girl, considering the question that had driven her research for months. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the most powerful thing one person can do is show others what's possible." Marcus showed us that we don't have to respond to hatred with more hatred, that we don't have to let fear make us cruel, and that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the universe. As the sun set over the transformed city, the memorial garden filled with the quiet conversations of people from all walks of life, former enemies, seeking reconciliation, families healing from generations of pain, and individuals struggling to live up to the example of a man who had chosen love in his final moments. Marcus Chun's body lay buried beneath the memorial stone, but his spirit lived on in every act of mercy, every choice of forgiveness over revenge, and every moment when someone chose to see the humanity in their enemies. His death had ended one story, but it had begun countless other stories of transformation, redemption, and the terrifying, beautiful power of unconditional love. The weight of mercy, it turned out, was heavier than any weapon and more powerful than any force on Earth, *.